But if I could introduce Stephen Adams as our next speaker. Before becoming a partner at Global Counsel, Stephen was a senior policy and political advisor at the European Commission and the UK Department of Business, where he was working primarily on trade policy, including Ukraine. Previously, Stephen was a vice president in the executive office of Goldman Sachs International and a political advisor in the European Parliament. Stephen is going to focus on relations with the European Union. Stephen.
Great, thank you. Right, well, I have neither silvery hair, nor did I go to Columbia, which actually makes me the odd one out on this panel, which is quite unusual. I'll echo everybody else by saying thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for your patience and in advance for your questions. I want to say a few things about, well, first of all, just to reiterate, I was a political and policy advisor in the European Commission between 2004 and 2009, and I worked primarily on commercial policy, cross-border commercial policy. And I was involved, among other things, with the negotiations on Ukraine's WTO entry and the running saga, and it was an increasingly bitter saga, of EU trade relations with Russia. And one of the things I actually want to talk about this evening, or at least flag this evening, is how important that deteriorating relationship was in shaping some of the events that led up to last November. And it's something of a parlor game, I think, to kind of try and pick out the biggest failures in EU foreign policy. And I don't kind of really want to indulge in that. But last year was a bit of a cracker. And I also don't want to fall into the trap of saying that there were areas in which the EU failed, of therefore assuming or implying that, in fact, it could have done things dramatically differently. Because I think if the two speakers before me have emphasized anything, it's that there are huge forces at play here in Ukraine and in the relationship between Ukraine and its neighbors that EU foreign policy would have struggled in any context, I think, to have made a huge impact on. But I want to flag 5 things. I want to say 4 things about the past and the present and 1 thing about the future. And the first of those is I think that, and again, I'm going to slightly talk out of school, and I realize we're on the record, but I'm going to talk out of school and implicitly pass a little bit of judgment both on myself and my colleagues and friends from the European Commission, from the middle of the last decade. But I think one of the things that they would agree with me on is that the EU's relationship with Russia, and in particular its trade policy relations with Russia, started to deteriorate quite badly after 2004. And something happened in 2004 which I think a lot of people outside of the kind of trade policy world are not really aware of, which is that the EU signed off politically on the prospect of Russian WTO membership. And in doing so, it gave up a list of trade policy asks that it had been pressing on Russia for the best part of 6 years before that. And within the bureaucracy, that was regarded as being a very pivotal moment. It was a moment at which the EU gave up some key leverage on Russia with respect to its trade relations. And I think that from that point onwards, and by the way, the reason why that leverage was given up and Russian WTO membership agreed in principle was because the EU was looking for a gesture to offer a dynamic young Russian president by the name of Vladimir Putin. And in the years after that, the trade policy negotiating relationship with Russia, I think, became rockier and rockier. And it was partly down to the personal relationships between the negotiators, the links between the bureaucracies. And as Putin evolved as a policymaker, it got worse and worse. And Georgia in 2008, obviously, the accession of the Ukraine in 2008, of Ukraine to the WTO in 2008, which Moscow took very badly and responded to by essentially suspending its own WTO ambitions, such that they were, as a way of gesturing that anything that was good enough for Ukraine was therefore not necessary for Russia. And then, of course, Putin's development of a parallel trade policy agenda based on his Eurasian Union, which was an explicitly exclusive concept designed to create a customs union among Russia and its immediate neighbors, all further soured this relationship. And what it meant was that by the time negotiations on the association agreement at the beginning of last year really started to accelerate, and the serious prospect of something actually being signed in Vilnius in November last year became real, Brussels and Moscow really weren't talking about how Moscow would respond. And that's my first point. My second point is that that problem was exacerbated by a structural problem with EU foreign policy, which is a slightly unusual one, which is that relations with the Ukraine are managed through DG enlargement, through the enlargement bureaucracy of the Commission. Ukraine is treated loosely as an enlargement state. And the External Action Service of the European Commission, or of the European Union, which is the foreign policy arm, operated almost entirely in isolation from the day-to-day work of DG Enlargement and DG Trade, which were managing the association agreement. And that meant that, as I say, as we got closer and closer to November last year, these important bits of the bureaucracy weren't talking to each other, and neither of them was really talking to Moscow. And given the warning that we had in Armenia earlier last year on how Moscow was likely to react to the signing of an association agreement, I think in retrospect that will look like a failure of both policy and communication, failure of both. It, however, really only emphasizes a bigger problem, which is that the EU as a policy-making instrument has really struggled to find a way of thinking about and talking to Ukraine since 2004. The EU has a tendency to flatter, I think is probably the right word, certainly to encourage the reformist ambitions of governments like that, which took power in Kiev in 2004. The trouble is, of course, that in the interim period, in the subsequent 10 years, the EU has found it impossible to offer even the vaguest prospect of a clearly defined, a clarified relationship with the European Union that goes beyond the loosest forms of kind of economic integration in the form of a free trade agreement. And for all the big promises of kind of steering Ukraine on a journey towards its own Europeanization or Europeanness, that's proven very, very difficult to render concrete in any way. And that's a problem that we still have. And it reflects an underlying problem in the EU with respect to the question of enlargement, where the EU's borders should be, what should be extended to the states on the European Union's eastern periphery in terms of a prospect for membership or some variant of membership. And that's a really big challenge with respect to the Ukraine that the EU will now have to try and resolve. And I'll come back to that just in finishing. Well, let me finish on that point then. That points to the basic problem now for the EU, which is that it's not totally clear what Europe's offer to the Ukraine is going to be. There's obviously going to be some money, and it will come with contingent conditions attached. And I think, as the other speakers have emphasized, some of the kind of slightly heady mood of political renewal will now have to go through the ringer of implementing what is going to be painful economic reform and change. And the EU is inevitably going to have to be a driver of that. So what's that going to do to the relationship? It's an interesting question. In the longer term, the EU in the last 6 weeks has shifted its language. Up until about 6 weeks, up until 2 weeks ago, it spoke about the association agreement as the end of the process for the EU and the Ukraine. It's stopped doing that now. It started to talk about a longer process. But where that journey ends is a really difficult question to solve, and we haven't found an answer to it in the last 10 years, so it's not clear to me what the answer will be now. One possible end of the journey may be some form of associate membership of the European Union. And one of the things that the EU is now moving towards is a two-tier structure where some forms of associate membership are possible. And in fact, we in the UK might find ourselves a decade from now on that second tier. And the thought I would leave you with is that one possibility is that alongside us on that second tier, we may find some version of the Ukraine.
Stephen, thank you very much.